here with Felicia Wong, who is the chief strategist and principal for the Roosevelt Institute, which is a progressive think tank, student network, and nonprofit partner to the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. She served as CEO for 12 years, leading the Institute's efforts to envision a new economic reality, one that challenges unchecked corporate power and uplifts American workers. So thank you so much, Felicia, for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
So if you want to just start with a brief introduction, kind of to the mission of the Roosevelt Institute and maybe why you got involved in this work.
Yeah, well, first of all, I am thrilled to be here. It is really great talking to you, in part because I find it so admirable that you're trying to get these ideas, which can seem big or scary or multisyllabic, out to a much broader audience, younger people, people your age. So I am super admiring of what you're trying to do. The Roosevelt Institute's normal audience is more quote unquote elite. But I do think that the ideas that Roosevelt is trying to promote, which you described very accurately as uplifting American workers and making sure that corporations do not run our lives in ways that are bad for our health, bad for our mental health, bad for our pocketbooks. Anyway, those are the kinds of policies that we try to uh, both develop and then move out into the world. A little bit more about the Roosevelt Institute. The Roosevelt Institute was actually founded by Franklin Roosevelt, was president in the 1930s and 1940s, but it was founded by Roosevelt in 1938. He actually believed in public education and in learning and in libraries. So he was the first person to have the idea of a presidential library. And he, in fact, said that to found a library, to invest in a library is an act of faith in the American people and an act of faith in our democracy. But anyway, he started the presidential library system. He put all his papers into a library for the American public. And then he realized, oh, we need a kind of Friends of the Library, a nonprofit entity to continue to support that library, to bring people in, to provide resources. So that was the genesis of the Roosevelt Institute. Fast forward 75 years, a number of us decided, the Roosevelt Institute board decided that the library stuff was great, celebrating Franklin and Eleanor and their history was great, but also these ideas are still relevant today. Right? We still need stronger unions today. We still need a stronger antitrust movement today, meaning, again, a set of government entities that can make sure that Amazon doesn't run our lives. And in order for that to happen, we needed not just a backward looking organization, but also a forward looking organization that could develop policies, make sure those policies were actually good for the economy and good for people, and then try to get those policies to, frankly, senators, congressional candidates, presidential candidates, the media, people who could actually do something about it. So that is a little bit about the history of the Roosevelt Institute, and what we have tried to do.
Awesome. So, um, before we talk about why what the Roosevelt Institute is doing is so important, we should probably get into why it's so necessary and kind of what the hell went wrong with the economy in the last couple decades. So people feel like the current economic system isn't working for them, young people, working people especially. Kind of why is that? And is that by design? I know that's two loaded questions, but
Well, people are right. Working people are right that the current economy, and especially the economy that has developed since about 1980, really isn't working for them. Um, some people, Bernie Sanders uses the rules are rigged. Elizabeth Warren says that too. Many other politicians have been saying that as well. I actually think there is something to that. It also can sound kind of conspiratorial, like if the rules are rigged, who's doing the rigging? And we can get into that. But generally, I would say that people who feel like their paycheck isn't going as far as it used to, or it is harder to find a job. Meanwhile, a very few people, Elon Musk has now become like the poster child for this, but a very few people who are either uh, tech entrepreneurs, investors, Wall Street, CEOs, um, are making all the money. That's actually, that perception is very accurate because what has happened since 1980, we actually just, not me, that was not me, but people who were, economists and politicians, Ronald Reagan most famously, actually devised a system of government that said if you cut taxes and made government and government regulation much smaller, this is a very anti-FDR, anti-New Deal way to think about running the country, think about running the society. But if you do that, and if you put lots of money back into the hands of capitalists, and you also make it harder for workers to organize, but you make sure that most of the power and most of the resources are in the hands of basically managers, investors, ultimately, people who run the system of capital. The theory in the 1980s through the 1990s was that actually this was going to work. This was it famously, this is what was called the trickle down theory of how the economy worked. If you gave money to people who were smart at starting businesses and really knew how to invest and were really innovative, then they would create jobs. They were the job creators, and people would ultimately everybody would benefit. The benefits would, quote, trickle down. As it turns out, we have empirical evidence and historical evidence to suggest that that was not true. And in fact, that system, that quote unquote neoliberal system, let's see if I can only say that once in this interview, neoliberalism. But that neoliberal system that like markets, 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 private sector, private sector, private sector, business, 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 that system, which let's give its creators the benefit of the doubt. They thought it was going to work. It turns out it didn't work. The numbers will really show that between 1980 and 2016, that the economy that was created was much more volatile. There were many, many, many more economic crises, most famously the financial crisis of 2008. So, like, the system was supposed to be really stable, but as it turns out, it was really fragile and kind of janky. The system was supposed to make sure that people would have higher wages, but in fact, wages went down relative in this period relative to the previous period. And in fact, economic inequality grew absolutely astronomically. So what you had was a system that did work for a very, very, very few, right? We have many more billionaires. In fact, we're on track, according to some of my analyst friends, we're on track to see our first trillionaire within the next decade, right? So like it works well for a very, very, very few, but all of the resources that we need to invest in manufacturing in America, a better healthcare system in America, a cleaner, greener economy in America, to invest in housing, to invest in education. We actually have those resources now. They're just locked up at the very top. And that's because we have a system that doesn't tax those people, instead rewards those people and doesn't do anything, or doesn't do enough, I should say, to strengthen the hand of workers or people who are just trying to make sure that their families have a roof over their head and food on the table.
So, is this system that you were just outlining that's clearly not working for kind of regular Americans? I
People know it. People feel it. People are mad every election.
and this is something that gets like talked about in my comment section a lot, is this just, trickle down economics, Reaganomics, or is this capitalism itself that is flawed and not working? And I think it's partly because people want to understand what to do next, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
Very smart commenters, because that's a really good question. Um, I will try to answer the question of whether this is inherent to all capitalism or whether capitalism can actually work better. But before I do that, let me just say one or two more things about why trickle down didn't work. Um, the idea that basically that large companies were going to create jobs, it sounds logical, right? It sounds like sure, if you have if you have more and better businesses, they're going to create jobs. But a couple of things actually happened here. One is that even as productivity, these companies that were created in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, even as they became more productive, you definitely saw productivity going up. More and more of the resources, more and more of the profits went to either the people who were managing the companies, the CEOs, the executives, or went to shareholders, right? Went to the people who were investing in the companies. So these companies were incentivized not to cut costs and cut labor costs, cut their workforce costs as much as possible so that more and more of these profits could go to shareholders. It's actually one of the contradictions. Maybe we'll get into this question of contradictions of capitalism. But it's one of the contradictions here because you did see a lot of growth, but that growth ended up going to a very few people because the a market-driven economy and a stock market-driven economy is actually managers are measured by how good their stock price is, and their stock price is measured by how strong their profits are. And those profits are measured mostly by how little you can pay to workers and how much you can bring back to the top. So I think that is one reason that trickle down did not work. I think another reason that trickle down didn't work is that part of what would have made for a more balanced capitalism would have been stronger workers, and workers can only be strong and demand higher wages. There are two conditions for that. One is if the labor market generally is good. If there's lots of jobs everywhere and you can threaten to walk off your job to get another job, your employer is probably going to pay you more. So that's one important condition. The other important condition is very, very, very strong labor unions, right? Strong labor unions mean that people, especially people who are newer on the job or who are paid less relative to executives, they can actually come together and demand higher wages, better working conditions, more stable scheduling if you're working at, fast food or at Starbucks or whatever. Um, but very deliberately in this period. And part of the theory of trickle down was that labor unions are actually bad for the economy. They are very inconvenient for executives, I can tell you that. But that the idea was that therefore they were bad for the economy. So what you saw was what's called union density go from something like 30% in the middle of the 20th century to right now private sector union density, meaning people who belong to unions, is 7 or 8%. That means that workers just have less ability to demand higher wages and to take some of those gains of productivity back to their families, to their communities. So that's a weaker labor force and a stronger, more highly incentivized shareholder economy. Those are some of the key reasons that trickle down didn't work very well. And these were the results of policy decisions, right? There were policy decisions that made it harder to unionize, or policy decisions that made it easier for executives and shareholders to take more of the gains. So I hope that's a helpful explanation as to why this theory of trickle down just didn't turn out to work very well.
And then the
Oh,
follow-up.
you asked me about capitalism. You were talking about
Yeah.
and like whether there's a there. Okay, well maybe that's a good segue into like, is it possible to have a better capitalism? People disagree on this. Obviously, this has been a debate since Marx, at least. So since the 19th century. I would say, though, that it is possible to have a more balanced capital system. And I think that requires a couple of different things. some of which follow obviously from what I just said. But I do think that we need to make it much easier for workers to get what they need from their jobs. We need to make sure that workers can have stable scheduling, can have the kinds of health and childcare that they need, and can have obviously that they can, if they're working, they can bring home a wage that they're able to support themselves and their families on. And by the way, just logically, this is also good for our communities because if people have enough money to pay their rent, buy their groceries, occasionally go on a vacation, or occasionally, go out to dinner, or like all, like then you have a community where guess what? There are restaurants and there are functioning groceries. So like there's like kind of supply and demand 101, but it does but having allowing workers, or not allowing, but like creating the conditions where there's a strong labor market and where there's workers have the ability to demand, if necessary, what they want, what they need, like that is good for the economy. So that would be one way to better balance capitalism. Another way to better balance capitalism is obviously not to prioritize only the very, very, very short-term needs of shareholders, not to make sure that companies that get so big that they dominate entire industries in today, those real tech companies, the what's called the Magnificent Seven, the sort of top seven tech companies that dominate the stock market right now, and by the way, have driven up until probably literally today, because today is the day that the market's not doing very well today, because today's the day that Donald Trump announced, or yesterday, I guess, was the day that Donald Trump announced major tariffs worldwide. But at any rate, I do think that making sure that large technology companies, large companies that can use their market power to dominate the entire industry right now, just to pick on Amazon for a second, um, if you would like to buy almost anything online, whether it's books or diapers or light bulbs, or like it is very hard to do that without running into Amazon. And if you are a seller of any of those things, especially if you're a small or medium-sized seller, it's very hard to get your products out without going to Amazon. That means Amazon can really dictate the terms of commerce in ways that are actually bad for entrepreneurs, and can sometimes can lead to lower prices for people, but often can lead to the kind of market power where Amazon has the ability to increase prices. So again, regulating large companies is another part of what it would take to balance capitalism so it's actually working better for people. The third thing I would say is that we should be investing in things that we need. We should actually be investing in housing. We should be investing in healthcare. We should be investing in a much greener economy. And I will say that the Biden-Harris administration, I'm saying this as a factual matter, actually tried to push to promote this kind of private sector investment by using public dollars to do that. That was some of the Biden team's biggest accomplishments were actually this kind of industrial policy. But that has not continued. Instead, what you now see is a radical shrinking of government, frank, literally taking a chainsaw to government in ways that might or might not be legal or constitutional. But at any rate, that's a legal question. But the economic question is, if you need those powers of government to be able to create a more balanced capitalism, but you don't allow government to do any of those things, then you're definitely not going to get a more balanced capitalism. You're definitely not going to get what is going to work for working Americans.
Beyond some of the reforms that you just discussed that could potentially balance capitalism, are there other policies or ideas that the Roosevelt Institute has that people would be really excited about in terms of reworking the economy, or the things that you think could really, that you guys discuss a lot, that could really make a big difference in people's lives?
Yeah, so we're real fans of this is a somewhat technical term, but I think it's actually pretty easy for people to understand. Things called public options, right? The idea that if you need healthcare, health insurance, if you need childcare, if you need housing, your only option should not be whatever the market is going to provide. It should not only be something that is privately provided, probably dominated by, private equity or people whose job it is to only take profits from the system. Instead, you should have the option of something that is provided by the government in ways that, because the government's job, at least a Rooseveltian government's job, uh, the government's job, when that government is truly democratic, small d, is to actually provide for the public good, provide for the common good, provide for everybody. So, one obvious public option that we have and that we've all grown up with is the public school system, right? 90% of all American kids still go to public K-12 schools. Um, K-12 schools are one of the few places believe me, there are lots of problems with many K-12 schools, but mostly it's because they're not resourced properly. Teachers don't get enough money. There's not enough money for books and, supplies, etc. But public schools are one of the few places where American kids can come together, where we actually learn something in common, and where they're like a key institution in our society. Again, 90% of kids still go to public schools. We should better resource those public schools, but public schools are a public option. So let's just ask this for childcare. Right, for kids who are between birth and age 5, before you're old enough to go to kindergarten, why wouldn't you want a public option for childcare? I've got kids. I definitely would have loved to be able to send my kids to preschool when they were 3 or 4, or preschool, pre-K. I would have loved to have been able to send them to daycare in ways that at a place that was like provided for by the federal government. I could have had an option to do something else, but a public option for childcare is just one idea that I think would be like that. Public options are something that we at Roosevelt are really big fans of. We've got all kinds of public options for banking, public options for, um, got a whole lot of public options fans here at the Roosevelt Institute.
Um, and so this is kind of a conversation that could take, hours. So I don't want to, get um, too kind of in the weeds about it. But I think a lot of people, young people especially, feel like they are, feeling the emotional and kind of social consequences of this current economic system. And so,
Yeah.
young people are increasingly anxious, depressed, lonely.
Yes.
Um, and we don't necessarily need to get into kind of all of why that happened, although we also can. Um, but, do you see a world in which economic reforms could actually, economic reforms that actually, address those issues are possible, I guess? Like, could young people
I
actually see a
I
better
really do, but
agricultural life for themselves?
I'm always glass half full, and I rep FDR and Eleanor, and they did a lot of great things to make that possible. But so yes, I think it is possible, is the short answer. But let's actually go to this question that you ask of, loneliness, anxiety, that many people in our country. including young people, especially young people. Again, I've got kids. I see it. I see it in what they and their friends are really struggling with. Um, to me, it's the fruits of this highly imbalanced capitalism really gone terribly, terribly wrong, right? Because what is capitalism producing for us right now? It's producing a tremendous amount of toxicity, right? Through media, through social media, and in ways that are completely addictive. Um, you know, you start like, I'm just going to look up Instagram for like 1 second to find that one recipe for sourdough bread. And like 7 hours later, I'm down this terrible rabbit hole. I've wasted my entire day and I've probably seen things I did not want to see. Um, Maybe not the sourdough bread algorithm, but there are many anyway. So social media it's just one example of what, look, it's really profitable, right? So that's what capitalism is producing right now. And that's what is actually making us sick and sad and lonely. Um, it is keeping us from doing the things that we actually do know are good for us. Going for a walk, seeing a friend, like kind of everyday things. At least they were everyday when I was a kid. I don't know that they're everyday for a lot of kids right now. So I think that's one source of uh, real sadness that actually has come from capitalism. Obviously, this was made much worse by the pandemic experiences that we all lived through, but were hardest on kids. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that to the degree that the jobs that the system is now creating, with the 4 year exception of jobs that were created, during the Biden-Harris administration, there was a lot of effort to create jobs then that were actually going to be higher wage. You did see a full employment economy for a little while in that period, but it wasn't long enough. Generally speaking, the trend in the labor market, the trend for especially young people looking for jobs, is terrible, right? It's very disheartening to work for something in high school or in college, to study to be, I don't know, uh, could be a climate scientist, could be a reporter, could be, uh, somebody who wants to work in food, whatever. And just to have no options at the end, as you turn 18 or as you turn 22. That is really devastating. I think young people right now are graduating either from high school or from college into a really frozen labor market where people just are not hiring. And because people are not hiring, the people who are definitely not hired are people with the least amount of experience. So these are a couple of different ways that the market right now is just kind of creating sadness or is contributing to the kinds of anxieties that I think young people in particular feel. Um, I do think that better policies could improve this. I mean, this is a very old example and it's going to feel super old-fashioned even to me, but the government could actually do something, a very different government, I should say, could actually do something to correct for this. In the Great Depression, I told you it was going to feel like an old-fashioned example even to me, but in the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, classic public option, right, decided to create something called the Civilian Conservation Corps, hiring very quickly within 2 months, 3 million, ultimately 3 million young people, in this case it was young men, to go out and do work out in America's national parks. Like they planted trees, they prepared trails. like still, even to this day, I get people, obviously like in their 90s, saying to me that that experience, or sometimes people say, "Oh, my father was in the Civilian Conservation Corps. It literally changed his life. It gave him hope." So that's a very direct example of the way in which a public option can fill in where the market is failing. One of the things about public options is that they fill in where markets fail because markets do not provide universally, they do not provide consistently, and they do not provide the same things for people, either live in cities versus who live in rural areas. So you do need government to make sure that people are taken care of. But one there you could talk about a national jobs corps today. You could talk about national service today. There are genuinely things that, we're limited actually only by both our creativity and our courage. We actually have the resources to do all these things. We're just not willing to do them. We're not willing to do the hard things like tax the rich, that would ultimately allow us to do these things that would benefit more people. So, yeah, I do think it's possible to create a healthier, stronger, more equitable economy. We just have to do it.
And I think it's hard that we're kind of living in a time where people are increasingly skeptical of the systems and the establishment to make the case for public options, but I think you did a very good job kind of talking us through that. And then is there, anything else that you feel like would be, or kind of one reform you could think of that if you could like snap your fingers and make possible would have the biggest impact on working Americans?
Oh my gosh. I kind of want to ask you that actually. Uh, yeah, like what would you want? You get the magic wand first.
That's really hard. I mean,
I know that's why I turned the question.
give you time to think about it. I mean, I don't know. I think again, I think a lot about the, emotional and metaphysical stuff. Um, and any program that could both address economic inequality and the really growing and kind of dire emotional needs of American society and loneliness. And if there was some kind of, I mean, like the kind of conservation corps, some kind of mentorship program. I mean, they're just if there
Like
was
national service, would
yeah,
you?
yes,
Yeah.
something that both gives, people
Purpose?
purpose and income, I think would
Right,
be
right,
the
right.
thing that I kind of think about the most because that's I see them as both equally
Yeah,
very
right.
yeah.
So I would be a huge fan of that. I also think it would be something that would bring a kind of, if you have a common experience with somebody, then you all that actually that would bring a kind of, presumably, at least for a short period of time in people's lives, some kind of material equality or material equity. But it also would provide, like I just think many of us, rich people and poor people, and this is like goes without saying, but you would having a common experience would be, I think, could be transformative for our politics. And right, purpose and income, that makes a lot of sense to me. Um, the other thing that I was going to say, and I don't think this is possible, but maybe, didn't I said we needed imagination and courage. Um, you know, I remember when the internet was just being commercialized, right? Just going from, a government system, newsflash, internet was actually developed on government technology, technology developed by the Department of Defense, by DARPA. But anyway, I remember when it was being commercialized and we were people, this was in the early aughts, late 90s, early aughts, people were very optimistic that the internet was going to be this place where people could connect with each other, and in ways that would create, more community, more, again, common purpose, common good, but also, this is kind of nerdy, but the internet was going to be a giant library. Like, right? It was going to be bring more knowledge to more people. Um, and I would love any reform that would make that version of the internet more possible. and not I mean, it's one thing to say that much of what you find online these days is addicting and distractive and makes you makes makes us sad or lonely, but some of it's also like radicalizing for people in ways that really speak to our worst selves. So there's huge debates right now about whether or not the best thing to do is to try to break up big tech, to regulate big tech, to regulate speech online, to try to, there's lots of conversations about whether or not we should have actually a public option in things like social media. I'm not saying that that's I'd put public options elsewhere first, but at any rate, if I could see an online world that was healthier um, and less toxic, I'd put a lot of my chips on that bet.
I agree with that 100%. We have to get like creative about how we address
Right.
the issues of what's going on the internet. So I don't want to take, too much more of your time, but if you have any final thoughts, and then we'll wrap this up.
No, I just wish you a lot of luck. I think that these ideas that we've been talking about are not as complicated as they can sometimes seem. They're actually common sense ideas. And I really hope that your podcast, broadcast, uh, all of the ways in which you're getting this content into the world, um, makes people who think that this stuff is either impossible or too hard, makes them think it's both possible and hard and therefore worth working for and advocating for and believing in. So I wish you a lot of luck as you go forward.
Thank you very much. I hope so too.